The Mute Mountain Man wrote one word on paper for the lost bride. It changed everything. Section 1. Sometimes silence holds more truth than 1,000 spoken words. Sometimes the deepest conversations happen without a single sound passing between two souls who understand each other perfectly. In 1,887 Wyoming territory, Ezra Stone stood 6 feet 10 inches tall in his hand-stitched elk-hide boots, his massive frame carved from years of splitting timber and hauling stone, with hands that could gentle a frightened horse or carve intricate wooden figures by firelight. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, and a thick beard couldn't hide the terrible scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. The same injury that had stolen his voice 15 years ago, but left his mind sharp as the mountain air. Eleanor Whitmore had been traveling west as a mail-order bride to a rancher she'd never met, fleeing the suffocating poverty of her widowed mother's Philadelphia boarding house, when a spring blizzard and a broken wagon wheel left her stranded in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of desperate hope. When he found her 3 days later, half frozen and delirious with fever, he carried her to his remote cabin and nursed her back to health with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words could have. And when she was strong enough to understand, he wrote one word on a piece of birch bark that changed the course of both their lives forever. What kind of word has the power to heal a broken heart and build a bridge between two lost souls? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me tell you how it really began in the worst spring storm Wyoming territory has seen in 20 years. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her face against the small window of the mail coach, watching the landscape grow wilder and more forbidding with each passing mile. The other passengers, a traveling salesman and an elderly minister, had gotten off at the last settlement, leaving her alone with the driver and his shotgun guard for the final stretch to Broken Creek Ranch. She clutched her carpet bag tighter, feeling the weight of her few possessions and the carefully preserved letters from Thomas Brennan, the rancher who'd answered her advertisement in the Philadelphia Gazette. His letters had been practical rather than romantic, discussing the need for a wife who could cook, tend a garden, and help manage a household in the demanding frontier environment. But they'd also carried an undertone of loneliness that resonated with her own desperate situation. At 24, Eleanor had watched her mother's boarding house fail and their debts mount until creditors threatened to put them both in the poorhouse. Becoming a mail-order bride wasn't the life she dreamed of, but it was better than the alternatives available to a penniless woman in 1,887 Philadelphia. "Storm's coming in fast," the driver called back to her, his voice tight with worry. "Might have to find shelter and wait it out." Eleanor peered through the glass at the darkening sky. What had been scattered clouds an hour ago was now a solid wall of gray-black moving toward them across the vast Wyoming plains. The wind had picked up too, rocking the heavy coach and sending tumbleweeds skittering across their path. "How much farther to the ranch?" she asked. "Good 3 hours in fair weather," the guard replied. "But if this storm hits like I think it will." He didn't finish the sentence, but Eleanor understood. They were in trouble. The first snowflakes began falling. 20 minutes later, fat, wet flakes that quickly turned into a driving curtain of white. The horses began to struggle, their hooves slipping on the increasingly treacherous trail. Eleanor could barely see 10 feet beyond the coach windows. Then she heard the crack. The coach lurched violently to the right, throwing Eleanor against the wall as the driver fought to control the panicking horses. Through the chaos of shouting men and screaming animals, she heard the guard yell something about a broken wheel. The coach came to a grinding halt, tilted at a dangerous angle that told Eleanor everything she needed to know about their situation. "Miss Whitmore," the driver called. "You hurt back there?" "I'm all right," she replied, though her shoulder ached where she hit the window frame. "What happened?" "Rear wheel snapped clean through. Rotted wood. Probably should have caught it at the last way station." The driver's voice carried the frustrated anger of a man who knew he'd made a potentially fatal mistake. "Can't fix it proper in this storm." Eleanor climbed carefully out of the tilted coach, immediately gasping as the wind-driven snow hit her face like icy needles. The world had become a howling white void, with visibility reduced to just a few yards in any direction. "What do we do?" she asked, having to shout over the wind. The driver and guard were already unhitching the horses, moving with the efficient desperation of men who understood their situation. There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles north of here. The driver called back. We'll have to leave the coach and try to reach it on foot. 2 miles in the storm. Eleanor looked around at the swirling snow. Can we even find it? Have to try, the guard said grimly. Horses won't last long in this cold, and neither will we. They salvaged what they could. Some blankets, a little food, Eleanor's carpet bag, and struck out into the blizzard, leading the struggling horses and following a barely visible trail that the driver swore would take them to shelter. Eleanor had never experienced cold like this. Within minutes, her feet were numb in her thin eastern boots, and ice was forming on her eyelashes. The men took turns breaking trail through the deepening snow, but their progress was agonizingly slow. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the guard stumbled and went down hard. Charlie! The driver rushed to help his partner, who was clutching his ankle and grimacing in pain. Twisted it good, Charlie gasped. Maybe broken. Can't put weight on it. Eleanor felt despair settling over her like the snow. With one man injured and visibility near zero, their chances of reaching the cabin were slim. And even if they found it, would it have supplies? Would it even still be standing? Leave me, Charlie said, his face gray with pain and cold. Take the lady and keep going. I'll just slow you down. Like hell, the driver replied, but Eleanor could see the worry in his eyes. He was calculating their odds, and the numbers weren't good. That's when they heard it, the sound of an axe biting into wood, rhythmic and steady despite the howling wind. Someone's out there, Eleanor whispered. The driver cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, Hello, we need help. The chopping stopped. For a moment, there was only the wind and the horses' labored breathing. Then a figure emerged from the white curtain, like something from a winter legend. He was enormous, taller than any man Eleanor had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to block out half the visible world. He wore a heavy coat of what looked like bearskin and snowshoes that let him move easily across the drifted ground. Most striking of all was his face, weathered and scarred, with eyes the color of deep forest shadows that seemed to take in their entire situation at a glance. He didn't speak. Instead, he moved with swift efficiency, helping Charlie to his feet and supporting him easily despite the injured man's weight. With his free hand, he gestured for Eleanor and the driver to follow, then struck out through the storm with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. The cabin appeared out of the blizzard like a mirage, a solid log structure with smoke rising from its chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. The giant man, for Eleanor couldn't think of him any other way, helped them inside, settling Charlie on a bench near the fireplace. Before turning to secure the horses in what was obviously a well-equipped stable attached to the main building, Eleanor stood in the cabin's main room, dripping melted snow onto hand-hewn wooden floors, and marveled at what she saw. This wasn't some rough trapper's shack. The logs were perfectly fitted, chinked with clay that kept out every draft. Handmade furniture, chairs, tables, shelving showed the work of a master craftsman. Books lined one wall, more books than she'd expected to find in this remote wilderness. A stone fireplace dominated one end of the room, with a cooking area that included a real cast iron stove. Most surprising of all were the carvings. Wooden figures lined the mantelpiece and shelves, animals, birds, human faces rendered with extraordinary skill and artistry. This was the home of someone who saw beauty in the world and had the talent to capture it. Their rescuer returned from tending the horses, shaking snow from his massive frame. Up close, Eleanor could see the scar that ran along the left side of his face, a deep groove that spoke of some terrible injury. When he caught her looking, she expected him to turn away or show embarrassment. Instead, he simply nodded politely and moved to tend Charlie's injured ankle. Thank you, the driver said as the giant man examined Charlie's foot with gentle, expert hands. You saved our lives out there. I'm Jim Morrison, and this is Charlie Webb. We're from the Cheyenne stage line. The big man looked up and nodded acknowledgement, but didn't speak. What's your name, friend? Charlie asked through gritted teeth as those large hands probed his swollen ankle. Again, the man didn't answer. Instead, he moved to a wooden chest and returned with medical supplies, clean cloth for bandages, some kind of salve that smelled of pine and herbs, and a small bottle of what was probably whiskey. Eleanor watched him work, noting the careful way he wrapped Charlie's ankle and the gentle touch that belied his intimidating size. When he finished, he looked directly at her for the first time. His eyes were remarkable, not just their color, but the intelligence and kindness she saw there. They seemed to be asking if she was hurt, if she needed anything, if she was all right. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore," she said softly. "Thank you for saving us." He smiled in just a small curve of his lips, but it transformed his scarred face into something almost handsome. He touched his chest and then gestured to his mouth, shaking his head sadly. "You can't speak?" Eleanor asked. He nodded and pointed to the scar on his throat. "But you can hear us?" Another nod, this one accompanied by that gentle smile. Jim Morrison spoke up. "Well, mister, whatever your name is, we're mighty grateful. Miss Whitmore here was traveling to Broken Creek Ranch when we got caught in the storm." At the mention of Broken Creek Ranch, their host's expression changed. The smile faded, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. He walked to a desk in the corner and returned with a piece of paper and a pencil. In neat, careful handwriting, he wrote, "Thomas Brennan?" Eleanor's heart sank. "You know him?" The big man hesitated, then wrote, "He died 2 weeks ago. Heart attack." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Thomas Brennan, the man she traveled 2,000 miles to marry, the man who represented her only chance at a decent life, was dead. And she was stranded in the wilderness with no money, no prospects, and nowhere to go. She must have swayed on her feet, because suddenly those strong hands were steadying her, guiding her to a chair by the fire. When she looked up through her tears, she found him watching her with such compassion that it almost broke her heart all over again. "What am I going to do?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The mute man knelt beside her chair, his dark eyes serious. He took the paper and wrote something else, showing it to her with an expression of quiet determination. "You can stay here until the storm passes. Then we'll figure out what comes next." Eleanor stared at the words, then at the man who'd written them. A complete stranger was offering her shelter and help when her whole world had just collapsed around her. "I don't even know your name," she said. He smiled and wrote, "Ezra Stone." Ezra. She tested the name, liking the way it felt on her tongue. That's a good, strong name. His smile widened, and Eleanor felt something flutter in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. The storm raged for 3 days. During that time, Eleanor learned more about Ezra Stone without words than she'd learned about Thomas Brennan through months of correspondence. Ezra was a man of routines and quiet habits. He rose before dawn to tend his animals, not just the horses, but chickens, a milk cow, and even a small pig that seemed to regard him as a beloved friend. He spent his mornings working on various projects around the cabin, always building or improving something. His afternoons were devoted to his carving, and Eleanor found herself mesmerized by the way his huge hands could coax delicate details from rough blocks of wood. He communicated through writing, gesture, and expression with an eloquence that many speaking men never achieved. When Jim Morrison worried about getting word to the stage line about their situation, Ezra simply pointed to his snowshoes and the clearing weather, then wrote a brief note that he would ski to the nearest settlement and send a telegram. When Charlie fretted about being a burden with his injured ankle, Ezra carved him a pair of crutches perfectly sized to his height and decorated them with intricate patterns that turned medical necessity into works of art. And when Eleanor sat by the window on the second evening, watching snow fall and wondering what would become of her, Ezra appeared beside her chair with a cup of tea and a small wooden figure, a woman in a traveling dress, carved with such skill that Eleanor could see her own features reflected in the tiny face. "It's beautiful," she breathed, turning the carving over in her hands. "You made this for me?" Ezra nodded, suddenly looking almost shy for such a large man. Eleanor studied the carving more closely and realized it wasn't just a generic woman traveler. It was her, down to the buttons on her dress and the way she wore her hair. He'd been watching her, studying her, seeing her in a way that made her feel both vulnerable and treasured. "How long did this take you?" she asked. He held up 2 fingers. 2 hours? He shook his head and pointed to the window, then held up the fingers again. 2 days. Eleanor looked at the carving with new wonder. He'd been working on this since the day they arrived, creating something beautiful just for her. Ezra, this is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me. His smile could have lit up the entire cabin. That night, as Eleanor lay in the small alcove that Ezra had curtained off to give her privacy, she found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she'd been traveling to marry a man she'd never met, hoping to build a respectable, if loveless, life on a remote ranch. Now she was sleeping in the cabin of a man who couldn't speak, but who communicated more in a day than most people did in a week. Ezra Stone was nothing like Thomas Brennan had seemed in his letters. Where Brennan had been practical and businesslike, Ezra was artistic and intuitive. Where Brennan had offered security and respectability, Ezra offered something she hadn't expected to find genuine understanding and acceptance. But what did any of that matter? She was still a penniless woman with no prospects and nowhere to go. And Ezra was a bachelor mountain man who'd shown her kindness in the crisis but probably wanted nothing more than to see his unexpected guests safely on their way. On the third morning, the storm finally broke, leaving the world transformed by pristine white snow and brilliant sunshine. Jim Morrison and Charlie Webb prepared to continue their journey, now that Charlie could hobble around on his carved crutches. Miss Whitmore, Jim said, as he prepared to harness the horses to a sled Ezra had somehow constructed overnight. You're welcome to come with us back to Cheyenne. Come and you'll see that you get passage back east, if that's what you want. Eleanor looked around the cabin that had become a refuge, then at Ezra, who was carefully not meeting her eyes as he loaded supplies onto the sled. I need to think about it, she said. Jim nodded understandingly. Well, you've got time. We'll be making a slow trip with Charlie's ankle and this snow. If you change your mind, you can catch up with us at Miller Station. After the two men left, the cabin felt strangely quiet. Eleanor and Ezra moved around each other with careful politeness, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there when they'd had other people to focus on. Finally, as evening approached, Ezra sat down at his desk and began writing. When he finished, he brought the paper to Eleanor, who was mending a tear in her traveling dress by the firelight. I know you have decisions to make about your future. I don't want to pressure you or make you feel obligated because of my help, but I want you to know that if you choose to stay, it wouldn't be as a guest or a burden. It would be as a partner. Eleanor read the words twice, her heart beating faster. What kind of partner? Ezra took the paper back and wrote, the kind who shares everything: work, home, dreams, difficulties. The kind who builds a life together based on respect and caring rather than just convenience. Ezra, Eleanor said softly, are you asking me to marry you? He met her eyes directly and nodded. Eleanor felt the world shift around her. This man, who'd known her for 3 days, was offering her everything that Thomas Brennan's months of letters had only hinted at. But more than that, he was offering it freely, without pressure or expectation. Why? She asked. Why would you want to tie yourself to a woman with no money, no family, no prospects? Ezra smiled and wrote, because in 3 days, you've shown me more kindness, intelligence, and courage than I've seen in years of solitude. Because you look at my scars and see a man, not a monster. Because when you laugh at my carvings, or help me with the animals, or simply sit quietly by the fire, you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to wait. Eleanor felt tears starting in her eyes. But Ezra, I don't love you. Not yet. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. He nodded and wrote, I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for a chance. The chance to earn your affection over time. To prove that a marriage built on friendship and respect can become something beautiful. Eleanor stared at the words, then at the man who'd written them. In all her dreams of marriage, she never imagined anything like this, a proposal that was honest about its limitations while still offering hope for something wonderful. And if love never comes, she asked quietly. Ezra was silent for a long moment, his pen hovering over the paper. When he finally wrote, his words were simple and heartfelt. Then I'll still consider myself the luckiest man alive to have your companionship and partnership. Eleanor set down her mending and walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled mountain night. Behind her reflection in the glass, she could see Ezra waiting patiently for her answer, his large frame still as a statue, but his eyes full of hope. She thought about her alternatives, return to Philadelphia and the suffocating poverty that had driven her west in the first place. Try to find work in some frontier town where a woman alone was either pitied or preyed upon. Attempt to find another mail-order marriage arrangement with another stranger who might be far less kind than either Thomas Brennan or Ezra Stone, or take a chance on the most generous proposal she'd ever received from the most genuine man she'd ever met. Eleanor turned back to face Ezra, her decision crystallizing as she looked into his hopeful, patient eyes. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Eleanor and Ezra were married 4 days later in the parlor of Miller's Station, the closest thing to a town within 50 miles of Ezra's mountain cabin. The ceremony was performed by Circuit Judge Harrison, a weathered man who'd been riding the territorial court system for 20 years and had seen every kind of frontier wedding imaginable. Don't see many mountain weddings this time of year, Judge Harrison commented as he opened his warm Bible. Most folks wait for spring when the traveling's easier. Eleanor wore her best dress, the blue wool traveling outfit that had survived the blizzard, and Ezra had somehow procured a proper suit jacket that, while not quite large enough for his massive frame, made him look distinguished despite his inability to speak his vows aloud. When the judge asked for the traditional responses, Ezra handed him a carefully written paper with his vows. Judge Harrison read them aloud in his gravelly voice. I, Ezra Stone, take you, Eleanor Whitmore, to be my wedded wife. I promise to honor, protect, and cherish you, to share with you all that I have and all that I am, and to build with you a life based on trust, respect, and growing affection. Though I cannot speak these words, I write them from my heart, and I will live them every day of our marriage. Eleanor felt tears threatening as the simple, sincere words washed over her. When it was her turn, she looked directly into Ezra's dark eyes and spoke her vows with a conviction that surprised her. I, Eleanor Whitmore, take you, Ezra Stone, to be my wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you as your partner in all things, to respect your strength and gentleness, and to help you build the home and family we both deserve. I cannot promise love at first sight, but I can promise to open my heart to the possibility of love growing between us. Ezra's smile was radiant. Judge Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, and when Ezra kissed her gently, reverently, like she was something precious, Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the wood stove crackling nearby. They spent their wedding night in the small room above Miller's Station General Store. Eleanor had been nervous about this part of marriage, especially with a man she barely knew, but Ezra's consideration put her at ease immediately. He'd written her a note before they retired. We have all the time in the world. Tonight is just about being together. They talked, or rather, Eleanor talked, while Ezra listened and occasionally wrote responses until late into the night. She told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, her father's death when she was 16, her mother's struggles with the boarding house. He wrote about his life in the mountains, his work as a guide and trapper, the accident that had cost him his voice. A grizzly bear, he wrote when she asked about his scars. I was guiding a hunting party 5 years ago. Wounded bear charged our camp. I managed to kill it, but not before it got its claws into me. Tore up my throat and vocal cords pretty badly. Eleanor traced the scar gently with her fingertip. You saved those people's lives. He nodded, then wrote, worth it. Though I didn't think so at the time when I realized I'd never speak again. Do you miss it? Your voice? Ezra was quiet for a long moment, then wrote, I used to. But over the years, I've learned that there are other ways to communicate, sometimes more honest ways. Eleanor understood what he meant. In just a few days she'd known him, she'd learned to read his expressions, his gestures, the careful way he chose his written words. There was an intimacy in that kind of communication that mere talking often missed. When they finally fell asleep, Ezra on top of the blankets and Eleanor beneath them, she felt safer and more at peace than she had in months. The next morning brought their first real test as a married couple. They were preparing to return to Ezra's cabin when a well-dressed stranger approached them outside Miller's Station. He was a small, neat man with calculating eyes and soft hands that had never done hard labor. Mr. Stone? He asked, Though he seemed uncertain about addressing the giant man directly, Ezra nodded and pulled out his ever-present paper and pencil. I'm Silas Crawford, representing the Rocky Mountain Land Development Company. I understand you hold claims on some property up in the high country. Eleanor felt Ezra go very still beside her. He wrote carefully. What kind of claims? Mining claims, timber rights, water rights. Crawford smiled, but there was something predatory about it. My company is very interested in acquiring mountain properties for development. We're prepared to offer quite generous terms. Ezra wrote, not interested in selling. Crawford's smile never wavered. Perhaps you haven't heard the full offer yet. We're talking about enough money to set you up comfortably in any town you choose. No more harsh winters, no more isolation. Your wife might appreciate civilized society. Eleanor bristled at the implication that she was somehow dissatisfied with her new life, but before she could speak, Ezra was writing again. My wife is perfectly happy where we are. The land is not for sale. Everyone has a price, Mr. Stone. Crawford's tone became slightly less friendly. And I should mention that the territorial government is very interested in opening up more land for settlement. Claims that aren't being productively used sometimes become available through eminent domain. Eleanor saw Ezra's jaw tighten. He wrote with sharp, angry strokes. My claims are all legal and properly filed. The land is being used. Of course, Crawford said smoothly. But use can be interpreted many ways. A man living alone in the wilderness might be seen as simply squatting. A man with a family, building a real homestead, developing the land, that's different. The threat was clear, even wrapped in polite language. Develop the land or lose it to government seizure. Ezra folded his paper and pencil away without responding, then took Eleanor's arm and began walking toward their loaded sled. Think about my offer, Mr. Stone, Crawford called after them. It's a generous one, and it might be the best you'll get. As they drove away from Miller's station, Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from her new husband. Finally, she put her hand on his arm. Ezra, what was that really about? He stopped the sled and wrote rapidly. Land grab. There are men back east who want to turn this territory into mining camps and lumber operations. They use the law to steal from small property owners. Can they really take your land? If they can prove I'm not developing it according to their standards, yes. Ezra's handwriting showed his frustration. One man living alone can be seen as not making productive use of the land. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. But now, you're married. You have a wife. The beginning of a family. Which is probably why Crawford approached us now instead of waiting, Ezra wrote grimly. He wanted to make his offer before we could establish a proper homestead. Eleanor stared out at the magnificent wilderness surrounding them, the snow-capped peaks, the pristine forests, the crystal-clear streams. The idea of all this being destroyed for mining operations or stripped bare for lumber made her physically sick. What do we do? She asked. Ezra was quiet for a long time, his dark eyes scanning the landscape he clearly loved with every fiber of his being. When he finally wrote his response, his words were filled with quiet determination. We build something so permanent and productive that no court in the territory would dare call it squatting. We turn this into the kind of homestead that proves the land is being used exactly as the law intended. How long do we have? Crawford will file his paperwork within a month. Once that happens, we'll have to prove our case in territorial court. Ezra's expression grew grim, which means we need to accomplish in weeks what most homesteaders do over years. Eleanor felt the weight of the challenge settling over her, but also something else, excitement. This wasn't just about saving Ezra's land anymore. This was about proving that their marriage, their partnership, could withstand any test. Then we better get started, she said firmly. Ezra's smile was worth all the uncertainty ahead. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of back-breaking work and growing intimacy. Eleanor had never imagined how much could be accomplished by two people working in perfect harmony toward a common goal. Ezra expanded the cabin, adding 2 new rooms that would serve as a proper parlor and a separate bedroom. Eleanor established a kitchen garden in the small greenhouse Ezra built against the cabin's south wall, coaxing vegetables to grow even in the mountain winter. Together, they improved the barn, expanded the chicken coop, and built additional storage for the supplies that would prove they were serious homesteaders. But the real transformation was in their relationship. Working side by side day after day, Eleanor began to understand the depth of Ezra's intelligence and creativity. He approached every problem with careful thought and innovative solutions. When she mentioned wishing she had some way to preserve meat for the long winter, he built her a smokehouse. When she worried about being cut off from news and books, he revealed a cache of reading material he'd been collecting for years and promised to arrange for regular deliveries from the settlements. Most importantly, she began to understand the man beneath the silence. Ezra communicated through touch as much as through writing. A gentle hand on her shoulder when she was struggling with a difficult task. Fingers that brushed hers when he handed her tools. The way he steadied her when she climbed to help with the roof repairs. Each touch spoke of growing affection and respect. In the evenings, when the work was done, they sat by the fire, and Eleanor would read aloud while Ezra carved. She discovered that he loved poetry and adventure stories, classical literature, and scientific journals. His hunger for knowledge and beauty was as vast as the mountain landscape surrounding them. One evening, as she read from a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, Eleanor looked up to find Ezra watching her with an expression so tender it took her breath away. "What is it?" she asked softly. He reached for his paper and wrote, "I never thought I would have this. Someone to share the quiet moments with. Someone who makes even the familiar beautiful." Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. "Ezra," he held up a hand, then wrote more. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just wanted you to know that having you here as my wife, as my partner, is more than I ever dared hope for." Eleanor set down the book and moved to sit beside him on the bench he'd built for two. "You're not the only one who's found something unexpected in this marriage." She took his hand in both of hers, marveling at the contrast between his calloused palms and gentle touch. "I came west looking for security, for a practical arrangement that would save me from poverty. But what I found," she paused, trying to find the right words, "what I found was a man who sees me as an equal partner, who values my thoughts and opinions, who craves beautiful things and shares them freely, who makes me feel like I'm capable of anything." Ezra's eyes were soft with emotion as he squeezed her hands gently. "I think," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The kiss that followed was different from their wedding kiss or the gentle goodnight kisses they'd begun sharing. This was deep and passionate, full of all the feelings that had been growing between them during their weeks of partnership. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ezra rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," Eleanor whispered, knowing he couldn't say the words, but seeing them clearly in his eyes. That night, for the first time, they shared a bed completely. Eleanor discovered that Ezra's gentleness extended to every aspect of their intimacy, that his inability to speak made him even more attentive to her responses, her needs, her pleasure. They made love with a tenderness and passion that left Eleanor understanding why the poets wrote sonnets about such moments. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Eleanor traced patterns on Ezra's chest with her fingertip. "I have a confession," she murmured against his shoulder. He made a questioning sound. "I was terrified of this part of marriage. All the women in Philadelphia talked about it as something to endure rather than enjoy. But with you," she lifted her head to look at him in the moonlight streaming through their window. "With you, it feels like another way of talking without words." Ezra's smile was radiant even in the dim light. He pulled her closer and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and Eleanor fell asleep feeling completely cherished and protected. But their happiness was threatened the very next morning. Eleanor was feeding the chickens when she spotted riders approaching the cabin. 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of people on official business. "Ezra," she called, and he emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harness leather. He took one look at the approaching riders, and his expression grew grim. Eleanor recognized the lead rider, Silas Crawford, looking even more predatory than he had at Miller's Station. The men who flanked him wore badges and carried themselves with the authority of territorial marshals. Mr. and Mrs. Stone, Crawford called out as they reined in their horses near the cabin. I'm afraid we need to discuss your situation here. Ezra pulled out his paper and wrote quickly. What situation? The situation regarding your illegal occupation of territorial lands, said one of the marshals, a thin man with cold eyes. I'm Marshal Hendricks, and this is Marshal Potter. We're here to serve you with an eviction notice. Eleanor felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Eviction notice? But we're legal homesteaders. Crawford dismounted and pulled out an official-looking document. I'm afraid the Territorial Land Office has reviewed your husband's claims and found them insufficient. This property has been designated for development by the Rocky Mountain Land Company under the Territorial Development Act. Ezra took the document and read it carefully, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, he wrote furiously, This is fraud. My claims are legal and have been for 3 years. Claims filed by a single man for personal use, Crawford said smoothly. But this amount of land over 600 acres requires proof of agricultural or commercial development, proof you cannot provide. We are developing the land, Eleanor protested, gesturing toward their expanded cabin, new outbuildings, and garden areas. 3 weeks of improvements don't constitute legitimate development, Marshal Potter said dismissively. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. Eleanor saw Ezra's hands clench into fists, and for a moment she was afraid he might do something that would give these men an excuse to arrest him. Instead, he controlled himself with visible effort and wrote another note. I demand a hearing before the territorial judge. I have the right to present evidence of our legitimate homestead. Crawford's smile was triumphant. Of course you do. Judge Morrison will hear your case next month in Cheyenne. Until then, this property is under territorial protection. You'll need to relocate. Next month? Eleanor's voice rose with indignation. But that's plenty of time to prepare your case, Crawford finished. Assuming you have one. The marshals mounted their horses and prepared to leave, but Crawford lingered for a moment. Mr. Stone, my original offer still stands. Sell to us willingly, and you'll have enough money to buy a nice little place in town. Continue to fight this, and you'll end up with nothing but legal bills you can't afford. After they rode away, Eleanor and Ezra stood in their dooryard, holding each other and staring at the eviction notice that threatened to destroy everything they built together. What do we do now? Eleanor whispered. Ezra was quiet for a long time, his arm tied around her shoulders. When he finally pulled out his paper to respond, his handwriting was shaky with suppressed emotion. We don't give up. We find a way to prove that this is our home, our land, our life. And we find a way to expose Crawford's fraud before he destroys other families the way he's trying to destroy us. Eleanor looked around at their beautiful mountain valley, at the cabin they'd expanded with their own hands, at the life they'd begun building together. The thought of losing it all was unbearable. But as she looked up at her husband's determined face, she realized something that gave her hope. They weren't the same people who'd met during a blizzard a month ago. They'd become a team, partners in every sense of the word. And if anyone could find a way to fight this injustice, it was the two of them working together. Then we fight, she said firmly. Whatever it takes. Ezra's smile was fierce with pride and love. He pulled her closer and kissed her hard, and Eleanor knew that whatever came next, they would face it as true partners. But first, they had to figure out how to prove their case when their opponents held all the legal cards and had the power of the territorial government behind them. That night, as they sat by the fire, planning their defense, neither of them noticed a figure watching their cabin from the ridge above. Someone who had been tracking Crawford's activities for months and was very interested in what the land grabber was trying to steal next. Their fight was about to gain an unexpected ally. The unexpected ally revealed herself the next morning as Eleanor was hanging laundry behind the cabin. A woman emerged from the tree line, tall, weathered, dressed in practical buckskins with a rifle slung across her back and the confident stride of someone completely at home in the wilderness. Mrs. Stone? The woman called out. I'm Kate Morrison. I believe you know my husband, Judge Harrison Morrison. Eleanor nearly dropped the sheet she was hanging. Judge Morrison is your husband? Kate Morrison smiled, revealing laugh lines around intelligent green eyes. 23 years this spring. I've been tracking Silas Crawford's activities for the better part of 6 months, and I have some information you and your husband need to hear. Ezra appeared from the barn, moving with the alert caution of a man who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors. But when Eleanor introduced Kate Morrison, his expression shifted to interested attention. Judge Morrison asked me to investigate Crawford's land company after several suspicious cases came before his court, Kate explained as they settled around the kitchen table with cups of Eleanor's coffee. What I found was a systematic fraud operation targeting homesteaders across the territory. She pulled out a leather portfolio filled with documents and maps. Crawford's people identify valuable properties held by small landowners, usually single men or families without political connections. Then they manipulate the legal system to force those people into impossible situations. Fake debt claims, corrupted land office records, bribed officials willing to declare properties underdeveloped. Eleanor felt sick. How many families? At least 15 that I can document. Probably twice that many who were too intimidated to fight back or too poor to afford legal representation. Kate's expression was grim. Crawford's company has accumulated over 50,000 acres of prime mountain property using these methods. Ezra was writing rapidly. When he finished, he showed the paper to Kate. Can any of this be proven in court? That's the problem, Kate replied. Crawford's very careful to stay within the letter of the law, even when he's violating its spirit. Most of his documentation looks legitimate on the surface. Most of it? Eleanor caught the qualifier. Kate smiled. Your husband's case might be different. See, Crawford made a mistake when he went after your property. He got greedy. She spread out a detailed survey map of the region, pointing to various marked areas. All of these properties that Crawford has acquired share something in common. They sit on or near major mineral deposits. Gold, silver, copper, but Crawford's company is supposedly interested in timber and agricultural development. Ezra leaned forward, his eyes sharp with interest. If we can prove that Crawford had geological surveys done before he started targeting these properties, we can prove intent to defraud. That he knew about the mineral wealth and used illegal methods to steal valuable land while claiming it was just routine development. Eleanor felt hope stirring in her chest. How do we prove that? We need to get our hands on Crawford's geological reports, and I think I know where to find them. Kate Morrison's plan was audacious and dangerous. Crawford's company kept their confidential files in a safe at their headquarters in Cheyenne. Getting access to those files would require someone to infiltrate the company's offices during business hours and somehow open that safe without being caught. I can't do it, Kate explained. Too many people know me as Judge Morrison's wife. But a well-dressed Eastern lady looking for investment opportunities that might work. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. You want me to go to Cheyenne and break into their office? Not break in. Walk in the front door. Pretend you're a wealthy widow looking to invest in land development. While you're distracting Crawford and his associates, I'll be working on that safe. Ezra's expression was thunderous. He wrote quickly. Absolutely not. Too dangerous. Ezra's right, Eleanor agreed. If we get caught, if we don't try, you lose your home anyway, Kate pointed out. And Crawford continues destroying other families. Sometimes the only way to fight corruption is to take risks. That evening, Eleanor and Ezra sat by their fireplace, discussing the plan and its dangers. Through their window, they could see the mountains that had become their world. The peaks where Ezra had lived in solitude for years, the valleys where they planned to raise their children, the streams and meadows that represented everything they'd hoped to build together. I want to do it, Eleanor said finally. Not just for us, but for all the families Crawford has already hurt. Ezra shook his head and wrote, I won't risk losing you, and I won't stand by while someone steals our life together. Eleanor took his hands in hers. Ezra, we're partners. That means we face dangers together. Not that you protect me from every risk. Ezra stared into the fire for a long time, his jaw working with internal conflict. Finally, he wrote, if we do this, we do it right. Full planning, backup plans, safety measures. Eleanor kissed him softly. Whatever it takes. They spent 3 days planning every detail. Eleanor would travel to Cheyenne, posing as Mrs. Victoria Ashford, a wealthy Boston widow interested in Western investments. Kate would accompany her as her financial advisor. While Eleanor kept Crawford and his associates occupied in the main office, Kate would slip away to work on the safe. Ezra wanted to come with them, but his size and distinctive appearance would make him too memorable. Instead, he would wait in Cheyenne, ready to provide backup if anything went wrong. The hardest part was the morning of their departure. Eleanor had never seen Ezra look so worried as he helped her into the wagon for the journey to town. "I'll be careful," she promised, touching the scar on his throat with gentle fingers. "And I'll come back to you. We both will." He pulled her close and kissed her with desperate intensity, as if trying to memorize the feel of her in his arms. When he finally released her, he pressed a small wooden carving into her hands. It was a perfect miniature of their cabin, complete with tiny details like the expanded rooms and new chimney. "So you remember what we're fighting for," Kate said softly, reading the emotion in Ezra's eyes. Eleanor clutched the carving tightly as their wagon pulled away, watching Ezra's massive figure grow smaller in the distance until the trees hid him from view. The Rocky Mountain Land Development Company occupied an impressive building on Cheyenne's main business street. Eleanor, dressed in her finest clothes and carrying herself with all the aristocratic confidence she'd learned in Philadelphia society, swept through the front door like she owned the place. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Crawford about investment opportunities," she announced to the nervous clerk at the front desk. "I'm Mrs. Victoria Ashford of Boston." Within minutes, Silas Crawford himself appeared, practically rubbing his hands together at the prospect of a wealthy investor. He was even more oily and predatory in his own environment than he'd been in the mountains. "Mrs. Ashford, what a pleasure. Please, come into my private office. I'd love to discuss our exciting development projects with someone of your obvious refinement and business acumen." Eleanor allowed herself to be escorted into Crawford's spacious office, noting the layout of the building as they passed through. Kate, playing her role as a financial advisor, remained in the outer office to review some preliminary documents while Eleanor kept Crawford distracted. "I'm particularly interested in mountain properties," Eleanor said, settling into the leather chair across from Crawford's massive desk. "I understand you've been quite successful in acquiring prime wilderness areas for development." Crawford's eyes lit up with greed. "Indeed we have. We've assembled one of the most valuable land portfolios in the territory. Prime timber, agricultural potential, and," he leaned forward conspiratorially, "between you and me, Mrs. Ashford, some of these properties sit on mineral deposits that could make our investors extraordinarily wealthy." Eleanor had to work to keep her expression neutral. He was admitting to exactly what they needed to prove that he knew about the mineral wealth and had targeted properties accordingly. "How fascinating," she murmured. "I assume you have geological surveys to substantiate these claims." "Naturally. We never invest without thorough scientific analysis." Crawford stood and moved toward a large safe in the corner of his office. "I could show you some of our confidential reports." Eleanor's heart raced. He was going to open the safe himself, right in front of her. This was almost too easy. Crawford spun the combination with practiced ease, then pulled out several thick folders. "These surveys cost us thousands of dollars, but the information is invaluable. For instance, this property here." He spread out a map that Eleanor recognized with a shock as Ezra's land. 600 acres that a simple mountain man thought was only good for trapping and subsistence farming. Our geologists estimate it contains at least $50,000 worth of gold deposits. Eleanor felt fury rising in her chest, but forced herself to maintain her role. "And you acquired this property through normal legal channels?" Crawford's smile was smug. "The previous owner was persuaded to sell. Sometimes people don't understand the full value of what they possess." "Fascinating business model," Eleanor said dryly. She kept Crawford talking for another 20 minutes, drawing out more damning admissions about his methods and his knowledge of mineral wealth on targeted properties. By the time Kate appeared in the doorway with a subtle nod, Eleanor had heard enough confessions to convict Crawford 10 times over. "Mr. Crawford," Kate said smoothly, "Mrs. Ashford has another appointment this afternoon. Perhaps we could continue this conversation tomorrow?" Of course, of course." Crawford was practically bouncing with excitement at the prospect of landing such a wealthy investor. I'll have more detailed proposals prepared for your review. As they left the building, Eleanor could barely contain herself until they reached their hotel room. Did you get him? She asked the moment the door closed behind them. Kate patted her reticule with satisfaction. Complete geological surveys for 15 properties, including your husband's land. Financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. And correspondence between Crawford and his Eastern investors that makes it clear they knew exactly what they were doing. Eleanor sank into a chair, weak with relief. We did it. We did. But now comes the hard part, getting Judge Morrison to hear this case immediately, before Crawford realizes what we've taken. That evening, as they waited in their hotel room for Ezra to arrive, Eleanor found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate woman with no prospects, fleeing poverty to marry a stranger. Now she was part of a plan to expose territorial corruption and save the mountain home she'd come to love more than anywhere she'd ever lived. When Ezra finally appeared at their door, Eleanor flew into his arms with such force that he staggered backward. We got everything, she whispered against his chest. Kate was magnificent, and Crawford practically confessed to everything while showing off his stolen surveys. Ezra's relief was palpable as he held her tightly. When he finally released her, he pulled out his paper and wrote, I was terrified the entire time. I don't think I could survive losing you. You're not going to lose me, Eleanor said firmly. We're in this together. Remember? Partners in everything. Kate cleared her throat diplomatically. We need to move quickly. I've sent word to Judge Morrison to convene an emergency hearing tomorrow morning. Crawford will be served with a warrant tonight. The emergency hearing was held in Judge Morrison's chambers rather than the formal courtroom, but it was packed with interested observers, other homesteaders who'd heard about the case, newspaper reporters, and territorial officials who'd been unaware of Crawford's activities. Crawford arrived with 2 expensive lawyers, clearly confident that his money and connections would protect him. His confidence began to crumble when Judge Morrison read the charges: systematic fraud, bribery of territorial officials, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their legal property rights. Your Honor, Crawford's lead attorney began, these are serious accusations, but my client's company has operated entirely within territorial law. Has it? Judge Morrison interrupted, holding up one of the stolen geological surveys. This document, dated 6 months before your client's company filed its first development claim, shows detailed knowledge of mineral deposits on 15 properties that Mr. Crawford's company subsequently acquired through questionable legal maneuvers. Crawford's face went pale. How did you get that? Those are confidential company documents, obtained through a legal investigation authorized by this court, Judge Morrison replied crisply, and they show a clear pattern of targeting valuable mineral properties while claiming interest only in timber and agricultural development. What followed was 3 hours of the most satisfying legal destruction Eleanor had ever witnessed. Judge Morrison methodically presented evidence of Crawford's fraud, supported by testimony from other homesteaders who'd been victimized. Crawford's lawyers tried to object, to delay, to claim procedural irregularities, but the evidence was overwhelming. The final blow came when Kate Morrison took the witness stand and calmly read from Crawford's own correspondence with his Eastern investors. The beauty of this operation is that these mountain people have no idea what they're sitting on. We can acquire $50,000 properties for a few $100s in legal fees and bribes. Crawford's face was gray with defeat by the time Judge Morrison rendered his verdict. The court finds that the Rocky Mountain Land Development Company has engaged in systematic fraud and conspiracy. All property acquisitions by said company over the past 18 months are hereby declared null and void. All properties are returned to their original owners immediately. Mr. Crawford and his associates will face criminal charges in territorial court. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the homesteaders who thought they'd lost everything. Eleanor found herself crying with relief as Ezra's strong arms encircled her. But the best moment came afterward, as they stood on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sunshine. Ezra pulled out his paper and wrote something, then showed it not just to Eleanor, but to Judge Morrison and the gathered crowd of supporters. Today we proved that justice isn't just for the wealthy and powerful. Today we proved that ordinary people working together can defeat corruption and protect what matters most. Judge Morrison read the words aloud, and another cheer went up from the crowd. Eleanor looked up at her husband's face, seeing not just relief, but pride. Pride in what they'd accomplished together. Pride in the life they were going to build. Pride in a partnership that had made all of it possible. Ready to go home? She asked. Ezra's smile was radiant as he nodded and took her hand. 6 months later, Eleanor Stone stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching her husband work in their thriving garden. The vegetables they'd planted in defiance of Crawford's threats were flourishing in the mountain soil, and the new fruit trees Ezra had carefully tended were beginning to show their first blossoms. Their homestead had grown into something magnificent, not just the buildings and cultivated land, but the community that had formed around it. Other families, inspired by the Stones' victory over Crawford, had filed claims in the surrounding valleys. A small settlement was growing up around a crossroads 5 miles down the mountain, with a general store, a schoolhouse, and even a small church where Circuit Preacher Williams held services once a month. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to her still flat belly, where their first child was just beginning to make his or her presence known. She hadn't told Ezra yet she was waiting for just the right moment to share the news. As if sensing her attention, Ezra looked up from his work and smiled. He set down his hoe and walked toward the cabin, his movements still powerful, but somehow gentler than they'd been when she first met him. Marriage and happiness had softened some of the harsh edges that years of solitude had carved into him. When he reached the porch, Eleanor stepped into his arms for their ritual end-of-day embrace. It was a habit they developed during their first weeks as newlyweds, and it had only grown more meaningful over time. "Good day?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his relaxed expression. Ezra nodded and pulled out the small slate he'd taken to carrying for quick communications. On it, he wrote, "Perfect day. Even better now that you're in my arms." Eleanor laughed and kissed him softly. "I have some news that might make it even better." Ezra raised his eyebrows questioningly. Eleanor took his large hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to need to expand the cabin again. Add a nursery this time." For a moment, Ezra went completely still. Then his face broke into the most radiant smile Eleanor had ever seen. He swept her up and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure joy. When he set her down, he was crying, tears of happiness streaming down his scarred cheeks. He pulled out his slate and wrote with shaking hands, "I love you. I love our child. I love the life we've built together. And I love you," Eleanor replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss away his tears. "More than I ever thought possible." As the sun set behind the mountains that were truly theirs now, Eleanor reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd come west as a desperate woman fleeing poverty, expecting nothing more than a marriage of convenience with a stranger. Instead, she'd found a love deeper than anything the poets had ever described. Ezra had been mute when she met him, unable to speak the words that most people took for granted, but he taught her that the most important communications happen without words, through touch, through shared work, through the 1,000 small gestures that showed care and commitment. Their marriage had been tested by corruption and threats, by people who wanted to steal not just their land, but their future together. But they'd faced those challenges as true partners, each making the other stronger. Now, as they stood on their porch watching stars appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor knew they built something that would last generations. Not just the physical homestead with its solid buildings and fertile fields, but the partnership that had made it all possible. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing Ezra's thoughtful expression. He wrote on his slate, "That first day when I found you in the storm, you were half frozen and delirious. But when you looked at me, you didn't see a monster or a freak. You saw a man who might help you." "I saw the man who saved my life," Eleanor corrected gently. "And I saw the woman who saved mine," Ezra wrote back. "Not from the storm, but from loneliness, from thinking I was meant to live my whole life alone." Eleanor felt tears starting in her eyes. Even now, after months of marriage, Ezra could still surprise her with the depth of his feelings and the beauty of his thoughts. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that storm hadn't come? If the wagon wheel hadn't broken?" she asked. Ezra considered this, then wrote, I think we would have found each other anyway. Some things are meant to be. As they headed inside to prepare for bed, Eleanor caught sight of the small wooden carving that still sat on their mantelpiece, the tiny replica of their cabin that Ezra had given her that desperate morning when she'd left to help expose Crawford's fraud. It represented everything they'd been fighting for. Home, partnership, a future built together. Now it sat surrounded by other carvings animals Ezra had made for the children who visited their homestead, flowers he carved to celebrate their first wedding anniversary, and the beginnings of what would someday be a whole wooden village representing their growing community. That night, as Eleanor fell asleep in her husband's arms, with their unborn child safe beneath her heart, she thought about the word that had changed everything, the word Ezra had written on birch bark during those first desperate days when her world had collapsed around her. It hadn't been gold or fortune or opportunity. It had been stay. One simple word that meant you're safe here. You're wanted here. You belong here. A word that had offered not just shelter from a storm, but partnership in building something beautiful and lasting. Sometimes the most important communications really did happen without sound, but they happened with perfect clarity between hearts that had learned to listen.